Good morning, welcome. Dean Fitz very graciously thanked a lot of us who've worked hard on this program, but he did not thank himself, and in fact he should have. He has provided tremendous leadership and support for building international programs here at Penn Law School, which include efforts that we do overseas to engage our students and faculty with the world, as well as to bring experts here to campus. And I think that this conference really represents the best of both of those sides of our efforts. So it's my pleasure to thank him for giving us the leadership and support that we need to do these kinds of programs. As Dean Fitz mentioned, we started last night at the National Constitution Center. Ambassador Faisal Rasool Amin al-Istrabadi was one of our speakers last night. I will not reintroduce him. You have his bio in the brochure, except to say that he is well known to many around the world for his work on legal reform in Iraq and his work on the Iraqi Constitution. He began his career as a trial lawyer in the United States, and for those of you who were there last night, I think we all saw in the best kind of law and order way Ambassador Istrabadi's fantastic trial lawyering skills, so I'm sure that he will continue that as well today. He is currently on leave as ambassador from the Foreign Ministry in Iraq, and it's my pleasure to welcome again Ambassador Istrabadi to set the stage for us and talk to us in detail about the legal issues and challenges facing Iraq today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here at Pennsylvania Law School. My first time in Pennsylvania, in fact, and to be here, particularly here at the law school in these lovely surroundings. We don't have many plaques in the Midwest about 1790. Anyway, I wanted to, in beginning to think about, what are the sort of legal and constitutional issues that will confront us in Iraq over the next decade. I have to go back to a belief that I had at the time in 2003 and subsequently, that we fundamentally were not in fact ready to make the constitutional compromises or the institutional compromises necessary to begin the processes of rebuilding not only the rule of law in Iraq, but actually rebuilding the state of Iraq itself. I don't have time today to get into the history, particularly after the Iraqi invasion of 1990, much less what Iraqi history before that. But by the time we arrived by the time we returned in 2003, and after, in my case, having been in exile for 33 years, the state of Iraq had been dismantled, sort of both by the Iraqis, in a sense, but absolutely by the occupation forces. I published an article in the University of Texas Law Review in which I argued that the critical element that was missing in 2003 and 2004 when we were drafting the interim constitution, which is what I was involved in, and then again in 2005 when we were drafting the so-called permanent constitution, that the critical element that was missing in the political class was trust. And this is not a small thing to have lacking in the new political elites. And in my judgment, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the lack of trust is not merely, at the sort of mundane level of, well, if you promise to do this, will you actually do it? It's the level of trust that if you and I contest elections and I lose, do I have trust that I will actually live to see the next dawn? And I think the answer to that in the current political elites is no. And this is why you have seen in the Iraqi political class impasse after impasse after impasse, including the failure now for not quite 7 months to form a government. So what I want to talk about are the changes that I think will have to be made to the political order. And after all, at least in my judgment, a constitution isn't really a legal document in the first instance, a political document. What I don't know, and won't pretend to have an answer for today, is how you actually get there. Because a deal has been struck, and we seem to be stuck with that deal. Is there a will to make the changes that at least some of the more sensitive changes that I will talk about today? I don't know, but I suspect not. We should have had a constitutional amendment process 4 years ago. And indeed, there was a parliamentary constitutional review committee which produced a report on a sort of package deal of amendments. That's never been taken up by Parliament. And now we have a new Parliament, although it hasn't really met. Will they be more successful? I'm not quite sure I see why they would be. But anyway, here goes. Let's see where we end up. I've divided this into sort of 3 categories. The first category I call existential issues. Yesterday, I think I mangled a Shakespearean quote, but I'll get this one right. These are issues of to be or not to be. These are issues of whether we've, somebody used yesterday the expression tipping point. This is whether we have passed that tipping point beyond which we can say the state of Iraq as a state in some form survives. That we're no longer talking about Kurdish independence or soft partitions or hard partitions or whatever it is that the Vice President kept advocating and kept having to write other op-eds saying, the current Vice President, that, well, we didn't understand his previous op-ed. And the first of those is that the Iraqi constitution was drafted in such a way, the current constitution, the constitution of 2006, assumes that there will be a sort of deeply federated state. And I realize that's not much of a technical term, deeply federated, but highly federated maybe. That is to say, a state with a symmetric federal arrangement in which the central or federal government plays a very limited role in limited competences, very limited competences, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, next. The problem is, this agenda, in my opinion, was pushed by 2 groups of parties in the drafting of the permanent constitution. One was the Kurdish alliance, which has advocated this position for some time. The other was a political party which very much dominated the process, in my opinion, the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq, ISKI. The chairman of the drafting committee was a prominent member of this political party, and he then was the chairman of the Constitutional Review Committee. And both the Kurds and the ISKI had this view that the highly centralized state of Iraq had to be sort of broken down into its constituent parts so that the Shia of Iraq would unite in the 9 southern governorates, the Kurds would have 3 governorates in the north plus, and the Sunni of Iraq would have sort of central and western Iraq, and Baghdad would be sort of on its own, and that you would create a symmetrical federation with each region sort of governing its own affairs, and the Iraqi army, for instance, could not enter a federal region without the regional government's permission. And that's in fact what the Constitution creates. The problem is, it turns out, the Arabs of Iraq don't want to live in that kind of Iraq, but the Kurds of Iraq won't live in any other kind of Iraq. And therein lies, I think, the problem. And that's why I think the extent of our federalism becomes an existential issue. We have not, in fact, created, in my opinion, theoretically at least, Professor Hamoudi will tell me, yes, but look at how they're actually governing. You're too much of a formalist. Fair enough. But we have not theoretically created a coherent governmental structure. And it's not clear to me that we can. So maybe it is better that we let things go along as they are. The problem is, in my opinion, and if I were a social scientist, I'd be thinking about ways of proving this. I believe that the Constitution of 2006 contributed to the civil war that we had in 2006 and 2007. Now, no, it's 2006. It was ratified in 2005, but it went into effect in 2006. May 20-something, 2006, it went into effect. Like the Constitution of the Basic Law of 1925 was ratified in 1924, but it went into effect in 1925, so it's the Basic Law of 1925. Now, this is a problem that has to be solved. Nationalists in Iraq, be they Sunni or Shia, in my opinion, view, in the Arab part of the country, view the Constitution as a recipe towards the division of the country. For the Kurds, this is the only recipe they're willing to buy into to keep the country united. Now, I don't know how this problem can be solved so long as the Kurds insist, as they have, on a symmetric federation, theoretically, in the Constitution, even though, in fact, we are an asymmetric federation with only the Kurdish region federated, and the rest of the country being more or less ruled directly by Baghdad, although American NGOs and USAID are very busy trying to decentralize the country, which admittedly is also in the Constitution. But the extent of that decentralization is very much contested with, for instance, an effort to create a federated region in Basra having failed rather miserably in January of 2009. I dwell on this particular issue, as I have for the last several minutes, because I think it is the principal issue in Iraq today, and until it is solved, we are always on this knife's edge of to be or not to be. Related to that is the question of the powers of the federal government. Under the current Constitution, the federal government has extremely limited powers. It has no power of taxation, for instance. The regions can reject taxes imposed by Baghdad. Laws that conflict with regional laws, federal laws that conflict with regional laws, are trumped by regional laws. My judgment, this all contributes to the incoherency of the government. Interesting that the successive governments have attempted to reassert the authority of Baghdad, so that this tension is sort of built in to the Constitution. The constitutional process, in my opinion, was dominated by parties with comparatively, and I'm using the word very cautiously, radical agendas. Radical, and I don't mean this in some existential way radical, but in terms of the Iraqi polity, the most extreme parties dominated the constitution drafting process. The rest of us are having sort of to figure out how to live within the document that was produced, and this itself is creating tensions. What I argued in the Texas piece is we should have waited some years before drafting a constitution until a modus vivendi appeared, until the politics settled. There is also an existential issue of what I call existential constitutional issues regarding disputed territories, the so-called disputed territories, which is a bit of a jarring expression, especially when translated into Arabic, because it almost gives the impression of you know, Germany and France having just some, you know, dispute over who owns Alsace-Lorraine or something. Perhaps a more felicitous term could have been found. The problem is that, once again, in the nature of the politics of Iraq, the political class has sort of escalated the rhetoric over these issues, and they are in fact explosive. Kirkuk, I'm sure you're all familiar, this has been in the news for 4 or 5 years. Kirkuk, with its oil wealth, is a disputed territory. The Kurds claim it. Handing Kirkuk over into the Kurdistan Regional Authority, or the government, the KRG, is probably one of the 2 or 3 most incendiary things that can be done that would ignite the civil war again. Every sort of, all of these major issues are highly explosive, highly incendiary. In my judgment, one of the things the political class has gotten right in Iraq is to put off the issues of the disputed territories. But the problem is that while the Kurdish political elites have in fact have de facto accepted the delay of resolving these issues rhetorically, they have, at least over the years, escalated the rhetoric over these issues. Places like Kirkuk, the United Nations has made suggestions that these territories should be treated the way Baghdad is, which is nobody gets them. Kirkuk for the Kirkuklis, I suppose, would be the motto. That Kirkuk becomes its own federated region, or sort of, you know, like Freistaat Hamburg or something, which I think is a compromise. Nobody gets it except the citizens of Kirkuk. I find that, you know, an aesthetically pleasing solution. But that isn't what the Constitution provides for. It provides for referendum by the territories that are in dispute, which, you know, sounds like a marvelously democratic way to resolve something, but it gets into the issue of the legitimacy of the referendum, and who gets to vote, and how you decide who gets to vote. It opens up all sorts of contentious issues, which I don't think Iraq is ready to face. Let me move on to the second category of changes that I think have to be made in the next parliamentary cycle. And I have to admit, I'm sort of thinking more in terms of the next 4 years rather than in terms of the next decade, although given the glacial pace of Iraqi politics, it may take more than a decade. And these are what I call structural issues. There are, for instance, some major flaws in the, with all respect to the parties that drafted it, there are major flaws in the design of the Iraqi constitution. There is a problem that I admit I'm partly responsible for, because we did it in the interim constitution and it was picked up in the permanent constitution, and that I now think is a really bad idea. And that is that we have formal American-style separation of powers in our constitution, such that we don't actually have a parliamentary system. We sort of have a quasi-parliamentary system, whereby when the And you have to understand, everybody in the Iraqi polity runs for parliament. Why, I don't know, but everybody runs for parliament. Every, deputy assistant director janitor runs for parliament. They want to have an executive position. God knows they don't want to be legislators. But they run for parliament, and once they are appointed to executive office, they're deemed to have resigned from parliament. So why they run in the first place is beyond me. But this has created some fairly absurd problems. One, you have a sitting government full of cabinet members who ran for parliament. We had the situation in which none of them wanted to take the oath of the new parliament because that would create a separation of powers problem, that they would be members of parliament while at the same time cabinet officers in the outgoing government, and by the way, they'd like to continue to be cabinet officers in the incoming government. So we had this sort of absurd position where the entire cabinet of Iraq did not take, attended the opening of parliament, but did not take the oath of office. We need to have some cure for this, I think, silly problem. The more important problem that it has created is that it has created a chasm between the cabinet and parliament, so that parliament, by and large, fails to exercise parliamentary oversight. It is a rare thing in Iraq's first parliament, and I emphasize first parliament, the parliament that may be setting precedents for the future. It was a rare thing for a cabinet officer to be called before parliament to be interpellated. And we gave parliament the power, both in the interim constitution and it was picked up in the permanent constitution, to call in cabinet officers and to interpellate them. But it has become precedent in the first parliament that you're only called in if you're in big, big trouble because you've been really incompetent or really, really corrupt, even by Iraqi standards, which is saying something, rather than it being a routine thing. Therefore, I think the solution is to return us to our prior liberal roots, or relatively liberal roots, and to create a purely parliamentary system in which the cabinet officers routinely have to face their parliamentary colleagues. Now, that might also help us to engender the institution of a loyal opposition. And maybe, and this is directed at any State Department employees that are here, and maybe we can get away from this notion that every government we form has to be a government of so-called national unity, which, because the parties have no shared vision for the governance of the country, means a stalemated government that can't pass, a hydrocarbons law. There are also some real problems in the Constitution in terms of, well, let me not characterize them, let me just tell you what they are and move on quickly, more quickly. The Constitution creates something called, at least I've translated as the Federal Council. It's presumably a kind of Senate. But the problem is that even though the chairman of the drafting committee, Sheikh Humam Hammoudi, said at the time in 2005 that the drafting committee needed more time to work to complete the document, the American ambassador, Zalmay Khalilzad, announced before anybody in the Iraqi political class had responded to Sheikh Hammoudi. Zalmay Khalilzad announced that no, the Constitutional Review Committee did not need more time to draft the Iraqi constitution. So, the consequence, and I was not an insider to this, And I know that there's somebody sitting in this room who was an insider, so these are surmises, not known facts. My surmise is, therefore, a number of issues were punted on. So the Constitution, there wasn't time to decide how to set up this sort of Senate, and we're at the moment we have a monocameral parliament. So the Constitution states that it is the Council of Representatives, although I think that's a silly translation, but it stuck. The Council of Representatives, through legislation, is to create this federal council. Now let's play this out, and I know the implications already passed through everybody's mind, but let's suppose they do. They haven't over the last 4 years, but let's suppose they do in the next 4 years. And let's suppose that the Federal Council and the Council of Representatives get into a dispute about a piece of legislation. In theory, in fact, the Council of Representatives has the legal power to dissolve the Federal Council and pass a legislation. This is not, a constitutionally pleasing state of affairs. This will have to be thought out. Similarly, we have a problem with the Vice President. He is to be created through legislation. I think we have a similar, although less serious, problem with that. We have a third category of issues that I think we're going to have to deal with, and that is what to do with the outgoing government. We have now had 3 elections in which it has taken us months, and we're now at 6 months and counting, to form the next government. What is the role of the outgoing government? I think this has to be addressed specifically. The precedent, both with the first 2 former prime ministers, has been that the government considered itself a caretaker government. The current outgoing government does not. It's signing international agreements on minor things like oil and natural gas. We need to have a clear constitutional provision, in my opinion, that deals with this. If you have a true parliamentary system, it sort of solves that problem because the old guard is out now. The problem is obviously if you have these delays again, which seems to be our fate. It should be noted that related to this problem is that our Parliament has not met since January of 2010, other than in June for the members that took the oath to be sworn in. We've therefore had for now 8 months no parliamentary oversight, and none is planned. And this is a problem that has to be dealt with. We have a ceremonial presidency in the next phase, in the permanent phase, because we'll be beyond the transitional phase. This is something of a problem because right now you can't convince at least some of the contenders to accept the presidency and break the deadlock because it's purely ceremonial and nobody wants to just sort of, cut ribbons and shake ambassadors' hands. There are other issues that I think will have to be dealt with, although I tend to focus on the constitutional issues. I'll just tick them off. We have a problem with the development and management of our oil resources. Some satisfactory way of dividing the responsibilities between the federal government and the regional or governorate governments will have to be found. That again breaks that impasse. The distribution of resources has been a problem. The electoral law will probably be re-examined. At least the Kurds, who came out fourth out of the 4 major parties this time, having been accustomed to being second or third before, will probably want to look at the electoral law. Although here I would ask a question. Every time we have elections, we pass a new electoral law. Now, it looks a little bit like gerrymandering. And then finally, let me just, again very quickly, go through what is, I think, a real problem, and that is we still have a wide variety of Saddam-era laws on the books that are being enforced that are inconsistent with democratic praxis. Let me give you one example. A reporter for The Guardian, the British newspaper The Guardian, reported that there were people in the Iraqi political class were saying that the Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki was acting like too much of a dictator. The reporter was prosecuted, essentially for seditious libel, and found guilty. There's a certain irony in that, but the point is that these laws are still on the books. The Prime Minister can still interfere with a judicial investigation into corruption by a minister. The ministers can still interfere, and by interfere I mean put a stop to. Ministers can still stop investigations into corruptions for inferior officers in the ministries. There's a host of these laws that are still on the books that really have to be re-examined in the next years in order to return us to some semblance of democratic governance and the rule of law. I don't know if I have time for any questions. I don't know if there are any, but in any event, that's all I have. Thank you very much.